Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's coronavirus webinar. My name is Kathy Purdy. I'm a marketing manager here at Schoeneck King. I'd just like to go over 2 quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please enter your questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and our presenters will do the best they can to address those as time allows. Once the program has ended, if you would take a moment to complete the brief survey, we would appreciate that. We share your comments and suggestions for future topics with our presenters, and it's very helpful information for us. So to kick off today's program, I'm going to hand it to Pete Jones in our Syracuse office.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. We've got a full program today, but before we jump in, just 2 quick housekeeping items from me as well. First of all, I wanted to mention in this webinar, some of you may have already seen this, heard this, but we at Schoeneck King are very happy to say that we are entering into a merger arrangement with Putney Twombly, New York City and Long Island, New Jersey-based labor law firm will be joining our firm effective April 1. We're excited about that. We think this is going to be an outstanding partnership, and so we welcome the Putney attorneys, and we welcome the chance to work collaboratively to serve all of our clients. Secondly, I just wanted to note that we have published a book on New York employment law. The book is designed to be a fairly easy read. It's a format that is designed to give a lot of information, answers to your questions on the essentials of New York employment law. So this link, we can push these links out here as well in the chat, but there will be links in our PowerPoint as well for those of you who access it after today's presentation. Okay, with that in mind, we're going to start today with a couple of updates on the American Rescue Plan Act, the first being on the COBRA subsidy, and John Godso, who's the head of our Employee Benefits Practice Group and in our Buffalo office, is going to start us off.
Thanks, Pete. As many of you know, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 provides a wide range of relief, pandemic-related relief. One of those provisions is a COBRA subsidy. Now, it's important to note at the outset that it's really targeted at individuals who lose their health coverage due to either an involuntary termination of employment or a reduction in hours. So we're not talking about all qualified beneficiaries who are potentially eligible for the subsidy. Some of you who have been around for a little while may remember there was a similar subsidy provision in a Relief Act back in 2009. This tracks that provision a little bit. This one provides for 100% subsidy. The one back in 2009 provides for a 65% subsidy, but there are definitely some similarities there. My goal today in our brief period is to give you some tools to understand where to start your compliance steps. We don't have enough time to go into the weeds on all these provisions, but provide you a good base of where you go from here in order to comply with the subsidy requirements, which generally take effect on April 1. So if we look at the first slide here, what we're talking about is a 6-month subsidy period, so from April 1, 2021 through September 30, 2021. And as I mentioned, this subsidy applies to 100% of the COBRA cost. So this 100% also would cover the 2% administrative fee that many of you may charge in connection with your COBRA coverage. So that's important to realize. Eligibility. So this is an important one. You must be what the statute calls an assistance eligible individual, or AEI. And as I mentioned, there's really only 2 qualifying events that'll put you in the bucket of an AEI. One is involuntary termination of employment other than for gross misconduct. And many of you who have been involved in COBRA administration over the years know that there is a carve out for gross misconduct in the COBRA law already that continues with respect to subsidy. Or the other loss event or other qualifying event is reduction hours. The COBRA period for that individual must include months during the subsidy period. So it's April 1 through September 20, 21 or September 30, 2021. So what this entails, though, is a look back period. And this may be the most complicated part of this law, is that anyone who may have had involuntary termination of employment, for example, dating back to, if you're talking 18 months of COBRA, back to November of 2019, they could be potentially eligible for the subsidy because their 18 months would extend into this COBRA subsidy period that begins April 1. So there is this bucket of folks who are going to have to look back and identify whether or not they're going to be potentially eligible for the subsidy. So that's going to be one of our first pieces of homework when we try to comply with this law. And the individual at the end of the day must elect COBRA. So those are the three basic requirements. You have to have a certain kind of qualifying event, involuntary termination of employment or reduction in hours. Your subsidy period has to include that April 1 to September 30, or excuse me, September 30 period, yes. And you have to elect COBRA during that period. So what else does the law entail? There's going to be new notice requirements. We don't have enough time to go into detail on all of those new notice requirements, but basically we're going to have updated COBRA election notices. These are going to be provided pursuant to model notices that the IRS intends to issue shortly. So look out for those. How do we get reimbursed? So if we have a COBRA subsidy eligible individual, there's a reimbursement plan within the statute that basically provides for the employer in most circumstances to claim the credit against Medicare hospital insurance payroll tax. And many of us may be used to doing this with respect to CARES Act and FFCRA tax credits. It's a similar mechanism provided for with this COBRA subsidy. Finally, the plans covered, what plans are covered. It's really going to be most group health plans that are out there that are subject to risks of the code or the Public Health Service Act, or state laws providing similar coverage. So if you're in New York, you may know that if you're a small plan or a small employer, less than 20 employees, you're subject to New York State mini COBRA. This law would apply to you as well with respect to that coverage. So that's the basics of how this law is going to apply. If we could go to the next slide. So what are our compliance steps? And these are just the 30,000-foot view. First, we're going to identify those individuals who may be eligible for the subsidy, who involuntarily terminated employment or had a reduction in hours, and their COBRA period would extend into the April 1 subsidy period. So this is going to include people who were offered COBRA in the past and never elected COBRA, and it's going to include individuals who may have elected COBRA in the past but dropped prior to the end of their maximum COBRA period. So, for example, they paid for COBRA for a few months, dropped after 2 or 3 months, but still if their 18 months had continued to the full length, they would be in this April 1 to September 30 period. They would be someone who we need to notify and let them know of this new COBRA right. Their election period begins 60 days from the notice that we provide as the plan administrator. That notice must be provided by plan administrators by May 31st, 2021. If we do that on the last day, that May 31st, then they qualified beneficiaries would have 60 days to elect. Again, we have model notices being issued by the DOL by April 10th of 2021. If folks elect this coverage, it commences April 1, 2021. It's not going back to their original COBRA date, at least under the specific COBRA subsidy provision. So that's your initial basic compliance steps. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what else are we going to do? We're going to need to update our COBRA election notices. As I mentioned, there's going to be model notices provided by the DOL to comply with these requirements. There'll also be notices that we're going to send to those look back folks, those second chance folks, that talks about their new COBRA election period. This alternative coverage option that's in the next bullet point, this is really the only choice that we're going to have to make as plan sponsors and plan administrators. You are able, at your choice, at the employer's option, to allow employees or qualified beneficiaries to elect a different coverage option as long as it's of the same cost or less expensive as what they are enrolled in at the time of the qualifying event. For those people who are used to administering COBRA, you know that the typical rule is you get to elect what you had in place at the time of the qualifying event. This expands that right to allow someone to elect a less costly option if they choose to do so. During the subsidy period, we're going to have to administer it. Again, it ends on September 30, 2021, unless the law changes or is updated. So we're going to have to see that that'll be the very end date, but it could end earlier. It's important to note this doesn't extend the normally applicable COBRA duration. So if you're talking federal COBRA and you're under 18 months, someone's not getting any longer than 18 months, that 18 months stays the same, even if they elect coverage as of April 1st. So that's important to remember. The other big piece of this, again, remember this is designed to cover people who don't have other group health plan options available to them. So to the extent that someone elects COBRA, gets the subsidy during the subsidy period, and then becomes eligible for, not just enrolled in, but eligible for other group health plan coverage or Medicare, then they are no longer eligible for the subsidy. They're supposed to notify the plan administrator, and the subsidy is going to stop. There's an affirmative obligation of employees or eligible assistance individuals to provide this notice of other disqualifying coverage. There's also a new COBRA notice that's going to let people know when their subsidy is going to end, and that's going to be provided in a new model notice by April 25th, 2021. Go to the last slide here, please. Tax credit, again, this is how we get reimbursed. Most employers subject to federal COBRA laws will claim it on the payroll tax against their Medicare hospital insurance. For small insured plans not subject to COBRA, so those less than 20 employees subject to just state law, the insurer is really the one that's going to administer this and be entitled to the tax credit. So what do we do now? Again, this is going to come into effect on April 1. We want to coordinate with all our administrators, the COBRA administrators, third-party administrators, payroll vendors with respect to obtaining the payroll tax credit. Folks, you want to just prepare for the pipeline of what's going to happen commencing April 1. We want to identify those folks who are either currently on COBRA and going to be eligible for the subsidy so they can stop making those COBRA payments during the subsidy period, or those people who are going to have this second chance election who may have terminated many months ago, but whose COBRA period extends beyond April 1 and therefore are potentially eligible to elect. Once we get these model notices, we want to do updates. And we want to look out for additional guidance. The last time in 2009, when this was done previously, a set of additional guidance was provided, for example, defining what is an involuntary termination and other helpful pieces of guidance that we need to administer this. Hopefully that'll come out shortly. Right now, we just have the statute. And what I've described is really the basics that we need to get started with, but certainly we're looking to the DOL to fill in some answers in the future here. So that's the 30,000-foot view. I think it's going to be a new requirement on top of requirements that we've had during this, during COVID and addressing pandemic-related relief. But it's something that we need to start paying attention to because it's really around the corner. This April 1st date is fast approaching.
Hey, John, thank you for that. And a quick update. We have a lot of questions in the chat, which is probably means it's a good thing that we're going to do this pop-up webinar later this week. Remind me again, is that Thursday?
Yeah, no, exactly, Pete. Yeah, we're going to do an enhanced version of this presentation on Thursday at 2 o'clock, where we'll be able to have a little bit more time and get into the weeds on some of these questions, because our experience is that folks have a lot of questions regarding this new requirement because it's going to require a change in their process and a little bit of work on their end.
So Thursday at 2. In the meantime, if you can't wait, please call your favorite bond attorney and we can we'll put you in touch with John or somebody else and answer any questions you have in the interim. There are a lot of very fact-specific scenarios that people have in mind. Thanks, John. Appreciate that. We're going to move on now to really the American Rescue Plan, kind of a part 2, some employment provisions. We've been detailing this week by week, and we thought it would be good to run back over some of the recurrent questions that we're getting. Adam Master Leo is going to do that for us. Adam's in our Syracuse office.
Thanks, Pete. Kathy, if you could move to the next slide, please. So what I'm hoping to do during my little time here today is give a general overview of the provisions of the American Rescue Plan Act that relates specifically to the extension of the tax credits for FFCRA leave. Before I get started, I want to go over some acronyms because I know that these acronyms can be a little overwhelming, and I use them all the time, so I know what they mean, but I think it's helpful to give just a quick summary. So the ARPA is the new American Rescue Plan Act that was just passed in March of this year. I'm also going to be referring to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was passed last April or March. That is the FFCRA. Within the FFCRA, if you all recall, there were two types of paid leave that were provided. There was emergency paid sick leave, or EPSL, and Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, or EFMLA. So with that kind of brief overview, I'm going to dive right into this. So by way of background, the FFCRA provided those two types of leave: EPSL, so the Emergency Paid Sick Leave, and EFMLA, Emergency Family Medical Leave Act leave. The EFMLA, or excuse me, the EPSL, the paid sick leave, provided 80 hours of leave for individuals who fell into 6 qualifying categories. So those categories included those individuals who were subject to a quarantine order, who were advised by a healthcare practitioner to self-isolate or quarantine, for individuals who were symptomatic for COVID and who were seeking a diagnosis, for individuals who had to take care of somebody who was under quarantine or isolating, for individuals or parents of children whose school or daycare was closed or their childcare was unavailable due to COVID-19. And then this sixth category of anyone with a substantially similar condition. So if you fell within one of those 6 categories, if one of your employees did, you were required to pay emergency paid sick leave for 80 hours. And that was the EPSL leave. The FFCRA also provided for Emergency Family Medical Leave Act leave, so EFMLA leave, which provided up to 12 weeks, 10 weeks of which were paid leave, but only if your child, their school or daycare was closed or childcare provider was otherwise unavailable due to COVID-19. So under the FFCRA, employers had to provide those leaves. The FFCRA expired on December 31st. As many of you know, in December of last year, the first stimulus package was put forward that extended the FFCRA through March 31st. However, it was no longer mandatory. Employers could continue to offer this leave to their employees and get the tax credit that the FFCRA provided, but it was no longer mandatory. So now that brings us up to the present. The ARPA was just passed a couple of weeks ago, and what it did was extend the tax credits that are available for employers who provide EPSL and EFMLA to their employees from April 1st of this year through September 30th of this year. A couple of other important things that the ARPA did. It expanded the categories. So remember, we talked about those 6 categories of EPSL qualifying leave and the 1 category of EFMLA qualifying leave. It expanded to include employees who are getting the COVID vaccine, employees who are recovering from complications due to getting the COVID vaccine, and employees who are awaiting the results of a COVID diagnostic test if they were exposed or if their employer has requested such test or diagnosis. So that's very important. The ARPA expanded the categories that were available to provide or to receive this leave. The ARPA also reset the 80 hours of EPSL. So if you recall, the EPSL was very specific that employers could only get 80 hours. That was it. It's different than New York's COVID leave, which we're not talking about now. The FFCRA was very strict. So that 80 hours is going to reset on April 1st. Again, just like the first extension in December of 2020, the ARPA extension of the FFCRA credits is voluntary. So you do not have to provide this leave to your employees. Next slide, please. A couple of other important changes that were part of the ARPA as it relates to these tax credits and employment issues. First, it increased the EFMLA credit amount from $10,000 to $12,000. If you recall, EFMLA, which was the paid FMLA leave that was provided under the FFCRA, was available for up to $200 a day for 10 weeks. So it was $10,000. The ARPA increases that maximum credit amount to $12,000 from $10,000. So that's an important change. Another important change is that the ARPA expanded EFMLA eligibility to all categories. So if you remember what I just said under the FFCRA, EFMLA leave was only available if childcare was unavailable or a school was closed due to COVID-19. The ARPA extends EFMLA leave now to all of the categories. So all of the 6 categories we initially talked about, plus the 3 that we talked about on the last slide, are now available, or qualifying events, I should say, for EFMLA leave. Another thing that the ARPA did was it disqualified employers from the tax credit where they treat highly compensated individuals, full-time employees, or employees with more tenure differently than those who do not fall within those categories. So that's a summary of the important changes that the ARPA made to the existing FFCRA tax credits. Next slide, please. So this led to quite a few questions that we've been getting. The ARPA changes to the FFCRA tax credits, they've yielded many questions that we've been getting from clients. I'm just going to hit on 3 of the primary questions that we seem to be inundated with. First of all, does the ARPA run concurrently with New York's paid vaccination leave? So I know we've talked about New York's paid vaccination leave statute on other webinars. I'm not going to cover that again, but essentially New York is also providing for up to 4 hours of paid leave to get vaccinated. So can they run concurrently? And the answer is it doesn't really matter. If you are trying to get the FFCRA credit, or if you're not, you still have to provide paid leave to employees to get vaccinated. That's part of New York's law. So it doesn't really matter whether they run concurrently or not. You can get the credit if we go through the next couple of questions, if you meet the requirements in the statute. But it doesn't matter whether you're crediting it as New York paid leave or FFCRA leave. You can get the credit so long as you meet the ARPA qualifying standards. So the second question flows right from this. First question, can I claim the tax credit if I only provide EPSL, but not EFMLA? And this is a good question. So you as an employer want to voluntarily offer emergency paid sick leave to your employees, that 80 hours, but you don't want to continue to offer the EFMLA. Can you claim the tax credit for one, but not the other? And, the answer to this question is not entirely clear. However, the way that the ARPA is written, it separates EPSL and EFMLA. So there's 2 separate sections within the statute. That implies to us that they are treated differently, and that so long as you are offering all of one, then you can get the tax credit for all of the one. Not necessarily that you have to offer all of both. So there's a little confusion there. It's not entirely clear, but that's our best read. Second question is a little more tricky. Can I claim the tax credit if I only provide paid leave for vaccination, but not any of the other EPSL qualifying events? So in other words, we talked about those 6 categories. You say, well, I want to provide paid leave for my employees who are getting vaccinated because I have to, but I don't want to provide paid leave for any of the other categories. Can I still get the tax credit? The ARPA is pretty clear in this that you cannot. You have to provide all of the leave. You have to provide paid leave for all of the categories under the EPSL in order to receive the tax credit. So if you refuse to provide it under one of the categories, you're not going to be able to take the tax credit for providing paid leave for vaccination time. So those are the most frequently asked questions that we're getting on the ARPA and these tax credits that the statute provides. So that's it, Pete. Thanks.
Adam, thank you. We're getting a lot of those questions, so that's good information there, and I'm sure that we'll get similar questions and more permutations on those questions as we move forward. Okay, we're going to turn now to Jeff Shear. One of the midweek webinars we had a number of folks asking for an update on the payroll protection program. So we thought we'd have Jeff come on and give us the latest and probably a review of some of the past principles as well. Jeff?
Great. Thanks, Pete. It's good to be back on the Good to be back on the program here, and we'll get started. So there are a few things have happened in the PPP world recently. Just this past week, you may have seen an alert come out from us actually about an hour ago. So I just want to reset for everybody where we are. So where we are right now is that the deadline for both first draw PPP loans and second draw PPP loans is March 31st, which is only a mere 8 days away, if I can count correctly. The House of Representatives has voted to extend the deadline by 2 months until May. And that bill is currently awaiting approval in the Senate. I'm not sure what they're waiting for. I'm hopeful that it'll be approved. And from everything that I see right now, it does look like it will be approved. But for planning purposes, you have to stick with that March 31 date. So if you're considering making application, get in touch with your bank, get your application in. A lot of banks have started to close their portals because they feel that they need to process the applications before the 31st. So get in touch with your bank. The next thing I wanted to review is that the deadline for forgiveness applications is that while there technically is no deadline for when you get your forgiveness application submitted. However, if your application for forgiveness has not been submitted within 10 months of the end of your covered period, that's the 24-week period after the date of your loan disbursement, you must then start paying back the loan. So it's probably in everyone's best interest to get that forgiveness application in before that 10-month period. Lastly, in terms of a recap, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any forgiveness applications that have been approved for any loan that is in excess of $2 million. If you're in that boat, I think we just need to be patient. I'm seeing zero forgiveness on loans of that size. Next thing I want to talk about is some opening of eligibility for larger nonprofits. This has been a pretty significant change recently. So first is that the American Rescue Plan, which we've been talking about quite a bit this morning, expanded eligibility for nonprofits by establishing a 500 employee per location exception to the general headcount rules. So what this means is that if your organization, if you're a nonprofit organization, has 1,000 employees or 1,500 employees, and you were previously ineligible to apply for a PPP loan, now, so long as you have 500 employees or less per location, you may qualify for a first draw PPP loan. This is essentially a de facto waiver of the SBA affiliation rules for nonprofits that have been affiliated due to management or due to common management or due to just their general organizational structure. Previously, nonprofits were considered affiliates if they had, for example, a common board of directors. And in that case, they were ineligible. That is no longer the case. So this is a really important opening of eligibility for nonprofits that employ well over 500 employees, so long as they don't have more than 500 at a single location. The statute itself was a little unclear on this, but luckily it was affirmed in an updated PPP first draw loan application that was issued just, I actually just saw it this morning, although it's dated March 18th. I think it was just uploaded on the SBA website this morning. And that application does include a certification that you're eligible if you are a 501c3 organization that employs no more than 500 employees per physical location. So we're very comfortable with that exception now exists. One thing I can't answer is what a location means. I think we have to use common sense here and look at where employees provide a majority of their services. I think if you're a large organization and you don't have a home office, or a few main offices or locations where people provide services. But maybe you're a social services agency and you have employees working in a group home and employees working in someone's house and in a variety of other places. You may still be able to claim this exemption, but it's not 100% clear to me on what a location means. And I think we have to use our common sense and look to see where that person provides a majority of their services. The next update, as I mentioned, the SBA has issued updated first draw application and second draw PPP application. They released this again just today. Today's the 23rd. I have to believe that if the PPP was going to expire on March 31, they may not have bothered to release an updated application. I think this is a good sign that people do expect the program to be extended. The last piece I want to touch on is the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. This is, as many people know, we have theaters and museums and things like that have just been shut down because of the pandemic. We've been waiting for this grant application to be turned on. It does appear that applications will be accepted April 8th. So they will be available and accepted April 8th. This is really huge for organizations that could use these monies. And remember, this is a grant, not a loan. And one of the more important changes for this perspective, that in the American Rescue Act, that this was modified to allow recipients of a new PPP loan to also receive a shuttered venue grant. Previously, that was not the case. That a venue could not receive both PPP monies and shuttered venue grants. Now the rule is that entities that receive a PPP loan after December 27, 2020 will have the amount deducted from a subsequent shuttered venue grant award, but they'll still be eligible for the grant award. Entities that receive the PPP loan prior to December 27, 2020 will not have the amount deducted. I'm not 100% clear of the reason for the distinction, but the distinction exists. But one thing to note is that entities that have already received a shuttered venue grant, which is really nobody yet, but if you do receive a shuttered venue grant, you may not then apply for a PPP loan. So if you are a venue that's considering a PPP loan and a shuttered venue grant, you should be making your application sooner than later for the PPP loan and then for your shuttered venue grant, and you'll have to time it appropriately. The last thing that I just wanted to mention is the employee retention tax credit. And I know this has been talked about before and its interplay with the PPP loan. And just to note that if your intention is to take advantage of the ERTC and you do have a PPP loan, that you cannot take the ERTC on monies that you have used, or you can't take the ERTC on monies that have been used to make payroll, has to be on different monies. So when you are calculating your amounts, just be sensitive to which wages you are using for PPP funds and which wages you are claiming the ERTC. That's probably a discussion for another time because I think I'm out of town. I'm out of town. I'm not out of town. I haven't gone anywhere. I'm out of time. So I will turn this back over to Pete.
You're looking forward to going out of town, perhaps.
Oh, you bet.
Yeah.
Anytime.
Okay, let's turn now to Kate Reed. Kate is going to give us a school update. I know there's been a lot going on here since the last time we sort of got down into the details. Kate?
Sure. So yes, the last week, 2 weeks has raised a number of issues for schools and more importantly for people who have kids in schools, which I'm guessing we have a fair number of those on the line today. So I'm going to focus a little bit on those issues that may be of interest to community members, parents, employers of folks that work in schools, et cetera. So the big one, school elections. So I personally don't understand. I have no interest in running for school board, but As somebody who works with a number of school boards, I know that lots of people do have a special calling to serve on school boards. So if you yourself are thinking of serving on a school board and wish to run, this is a very important season. It's school election season. It gets started this week and will end on the 18th of May. And we had a couple of changes in the law very recently that make running for school board a little bit easier throughout New York State this year. One of them is the reduction of signatures for nominating petitions. So typically, in order to get on the ballot in a union-free or central school district, you're required to have a certain percentage of signatures on that nominating petition. The legislature just adopted an emergency bill that will allow a reduction in the signatures required for both union-free central and small city school districts. For small city, you only need 50 now. For other types of school districts, it's going to be 25 voters or 2% of those that voted in 2019. That's important because in 2020, because of the absentee ballot election, we had a huge uptick in the number of folks voting in school elections, and school districts don't want to, the legislature doesn't want to have school districts have an impediment to getting people to run for school board. So that's great if you're thinking about running for school board. Also important if you're thinking of voting in a school election this year, by executive order of the governor, fear of contracting COVID-19 remains a valid basis for obtaining an absentee ballot for a school election. So you can obtain an absentee ballot merely by requesting one on the basis of being concerned about contracting COVID-19. A little bit different than what we had last year, which was that every voter in a school district was automatically sent a ballot. We're not going to have that happening this year. This year, you have to request a ballot. But if you have concern about contracting COVID, that's a valid reason under the existing executive order. There's also a bill pending in the legislature that we expect will be adopted at some point in the next week or two that will codify that in the school election provisions of the education law. Next slide. So big news was on March 19, 2021, the CDC issued much awaited guidance containing much greater leniency around physical social distancing in schools. Whereas previously the recommendation was 6 feet of social distancing in classrooms, with the exception of some carve-outs, which I'll get into in the next slide. Generally speaking now, the CDC is saying it is safe for children in classrooms to be only 3 feet apart, provided they are masked. It's important to recognize that this is the CDC guidance at a federal level. As far as New York State is concerned, this is of very little significance to us because we have a whole this is a heavy regulated area in New York State where there's much at the state level, the state local DOH, for instance, that governs what we can do in schools. So at most what this is of interest to those of us that follow what's happening in schools, and it provides an indication of maybe where New York State is going to be going, although sometimes there's a delay between what happens at the federal guidance level and what trickles down into the state. Other notable parts of the guidance: clarification regarding when ventilation is required for maintaining healthy facilities. There used to be a recommendation of physical barriers, which now has been largely scaled back. Clarification of the role of community transmission levels in decision making, recognizing that not every community within the country has the same rate of community transmission and community spread, and that the separate responses need to be appropriate based on those variability. And then also guidance for what happens when you do have a cluster or uptick in numbers. Next slide. So there are still certain circumstances where CDC is going to continue to recommend the 6 feet of distancing. So between adults, this is the recognition that adults have a much higher risk of contracting COVID-19 in a school setting, but also a much higher rate of serious complications associated with the illness when they get it. So there is continuing to be a recommendation of 6 feet between teachers and staff and between teachers and students in school buildings. When masks can't be worn, there's still the recommendation of the 6 feet. So that would be, for instance, in cafeterias, when kids are getting therapies where they need to be face-to-face with either other students or with therapists. And then during activities where increased exhalation occurs, so this would be singing, shouting, sports, exercise, etc., all the fun stuff in school, where there's still that recommendation of 6 feet. And then finally, in common areas such as school lobbies and auditoriums where greater gatherings are by necessity sometimes necessary, there's still the recommendation of 6 feet. Next slide. So again, New York State guidance has not been updated to conform to CDC guidance. I know that as a school lawyer, I have a lot of superintendents that are on speed dial with me that are just waiting for that guidance to be updated because they're getting a ton of pressure from their communities to try to get in as many kids back into school as possible. Very understandable. But don't pressure your superintendents too much quite yet, because currently what is in effect in New York State is July 2020 DOH guidance, July New York State Education Department guidance, both of which specified that it's 6 feet or barriers plus masking. So the 3 feet is hopefully where we're going in the future, but we're not there yet quite in New York State. Next slide. So everybody's asking about prom. Prom and graduation are two of the big issues that we're getting a lot of questions about, and schools are, I think, justifiably frustrated with the lack of guidance in terms of being able to plan for prom. At the current time, there is no specific prom guidance. Will there be prom guidance? Who's to say? Hopefully there will be, because I know that school administrators are looking for that guidance. So what is going to control in the event that we don't get any prom guidance? We have a couple of other guideposts. One is we go back to that July 2020 school reopening guidance, which actually provided a fair amount of flexibility for schools. There was no mandate of testing, first of all. And secondarily, there was fairly broad authority to have gatherings in schools, provided those gatherings did not exceed 50% of capacity, which is, if you think about it, a lot higher than what the gatherings that have been authorized in other types of contexts. So, an aggressive position would be that guidance is still in effect. It's not been rescinded, and it provides some authority to schools to have gatherings, notwithstanding the absence of specific prom guidance. We have other guidance that's potentially helpful and applicable as well, depending on what type of prom you're planning to do. It's been a long time since I've been at prom, but I do recall that sometimes prom involves catering, it involves the service of food. If your district is planning to serve food or have its prom catered, there is going to be indoor-outdoor catering guidance from the DOH that's also going to come into play that has additional restrictions. So occupancy is limited to 50% or 150 people cap, exclusive of employees and staff. And most importantly, you also have to have a rigorous COVID testing protocol to ensure that no one is participating who has not been tested for COVID. So much higher level than typically is required in the school setting. There's also, and I'm sure that Katie Anderson and others have reported on this in past weeks, but we have significant relaxation of the non-essential gathering guidance. So potentially that would also apply to a prom situation where beginning on April 2nd, we will be allowed to have up to 100 people outdoors or up to 200 people, or indoors rather, and up to 200 outdoors. And those thresholds being raised significantly in the event that testing is conducted. So that would be potentially the most conservative approach that would apply in the event that we do not get any more specific prom guidance. Next slide. Graduation, another big question mark at this point. We did have 2020 guidance, June 14, 2020, that was very restrictive. If we can think back to how things were going on June 14th, 2020, it was pretty grim. The graduations were permitted, but only outdoors and at a cap of 150 people with appropriate social distance. So if we do not get any updated graduation guidance, that guidance does technically remain in effect at this point. It's somewhat outdated, consistent with all of the other guidance that we have around gatherings. So we're hopeful that the state will understand that graduation's a really important, singular event for kids, especially with the stresses that they've been under over the last 12 months, and revisit that, because that's a very important issue. It's a landmark event for kids to be able to recognize them. And a lot of districts are really hoping for greater clarity on that. So I know there's a significant lobbying effort on the part of the New York State School Boards Association, New York State Association of School Superintendents, et cetera, to be able to get more leniency around graduation, especially now that we have greater leniency around high risk sports. It seems like that would be completely consistent and reasonable. But at the current time, we don't have any specific graduation guidance. So that's all I had for today, Pete, in terms of what's going on in the school world. It's a constantly evolving field, of course, and always happy to report back when we have updates.
Thank you, Kate. And I think it just, it illustrates, it's very similar in other areas too, that as things change and we feel that there's potentially, some new guidance from the CDC or some loosening potentially that is occurring nationally in other states, we still need to follow the guidance that's in place here until we get new guidance. And the guidance has been coming more slowly. But until we get it, the things that are in place right now remain in place. We expect to get new guidance in a lot of areas and hope that we will soon. So we'll just have to stay tuned on that. Okay, our last module today is an unemployment update. Paul Bueller is going to give us an update on what's going on and again, how the most recent legislation affects the continuation of unemployment benefits.
All right, thanks, Pete. I know you guys have already heard a lot today about the American Rescue Plan. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. We're going to focus on all the updates related to unemployment insurance, and then we can kind of talk about, practically speaking, how does this affect you guys? Because a lot of the changes to unemployment in the American Rescue Plan were really just to renew and to extend things that already exist. So, for example, a lot of the unemployment provisions that we originally saw in the CARES Act, the original stimulus, early 2020, those things were set to expire. They'd already been extended until March 14th. And now effectively, the American Rescue Plan has extended those things until September 6th, 2021. So that includes the additional $300 weekly unemployment benefit on top of the base New York State calculation. So that means that someone receiving unemployment benefits can now in total receive $804 per week, and that continues until early September. In addition, there were, and I'm sure you guys remember this from the CARES Act, there was expanded eligibility for people who wouldn't necessarily have been eligible for unemployment benefits. And those have been not only renewed, but the amount of time that people can receive benefits has been increased. So if you remember from the CARES Act, basically there was an extension for normal unemployment eligibility. Anyone who could receive unemployment benefits because they lost their job through no fault of their own. Under normal circumstances, they could receive benefits for 26 weeks. The CARES Act increased that an additional 39 weeks, or 13 to make a total of 39. The American Rescue Plan increased that so that people can receive a total of 53 weeks of unemployment benefits under the normal New York State eligibility provisions. And again, this is all fully funded by the federal government. So this will not drive up your experience rating. For those of you that are self-insured nonprofits, this is not going to be charged back to you. You're not going to get a bill for this. For all those individuals who had otherwise exhausted their benefits, the people who were self-employed, independent contractors, et cetera, those people who are typically not eligible for unemployment benefits at all. If we remember from the CARES Act, there was an expanded eligibility where they could basically collect benefits if they were out of work for one of 11 enumerated reasons, all related to COVID-19. Basically, people who, were experiencing symptoms or contracted COVID-19, caring for a family member, there was some reason they couldn't travel to work, or they were caring for a child, those sorts of things. All these reasons related to COVID-19, couldn't work. They were able to receive unemployment benefits. The American Rescue Plan, again, renewed the eligibility for these people to continue receiving those benefits until early September. And in total, they're allowed to receive 79 weeks of total benefits, total unemployment benefits. Again, fully funded by the federal government. This does not get charged back to employer experience ratings. It also does not get charged back as a bill to those of you that are self-insured nonprofits. In some, I'll say, high unemployment states, this eligibility actually allows people to receive 86 weeks of total benefits, but that should not apply to those of us in New York State. Because this amount of benefits people can receive is so long, there are many situations where people have applied more than a year ago to receive unemployment benefits. In all likelihood, they'll have to reapply at the 1-year mark because a typical application for unemployment benefits only lasts for 1 year. They have to submit their weekly certification saying, I haven't worked, but that initial application is typically only good for 1 year. Another update from the American Rescue Plan was that the first $10,200 of unemployment benefits people receive not subject to federal income tax. Not clear if it will be subject to New York state tax, but it definitely will not be subject to federal income tax, provided that you make less than $150,000 in gross income for the year. So presumably someone receiving unemployment benefits will not earn more than $150,000. So this provides those people a little bit of tax relief. For those of you that are self-insured nonprofits, governmental entities, and Native American tribes, there was also an increase in the reimbursement that you guys will receive. So if you guys remember from the CARES Act, there was a 50% reimbursement relief to you guys. You were basically only going to be charged 50% of the unemployment insurance benefits that were attributed to your former employees. The American Rescue Plan increased that to 75% reimbursement for the period starting March 31st, 2021 through September 9th, 2021. Again, from a practical perspective, this probably doesn't impact you guys all that much, simply because if we remember from January, New York State issued an order canceling all the unemployment benefit charges that were attributed to employers, self-insured, and those that normally participate in the unemployment insurance system, dating back to March 9th of 2020 and continuing indefinitely. So this 75% reimbursement relief really just means New York State is going to get a little bit of extra money from the federal government. They've already taken you guys off the hook for that money now. But if New York State decides to rescind that order, you guys until September 6th will get at least 75% relief from your unemployment insurance charges. Another quick update, basically the Biden administration has decided that they want to have a broader reading of normal unemployment eligibility. And so they've said that they think it's acceptable for people to refuse offers of employment if they feel that that working environment would be unsafe due to a great risk of COVID-19. This isn't a new rule. They just are more broadly reading the rules that existed. So from a practical perspective, you employers out there that are offering people a new position, you just want to make sure that your workplace is as safe as possible so that people are not going to refuse to return to work, cite some sort of inherent risk of contracting COVID-19, and then try to receive unemployment benefits at a later date. So those are the basic updates we've seen, particularly from the American Rescue Plan. From a practical perspective, this does not require a lot of action on your part. All these extensions, like I said, fully federally funded. All these things were basically in place already and have been extended to continue for longer. But again, they will not be charged back to you guys. All the existing framework for contesting charges, reporting fraudulent charges, all of that still exists. So basically, keep doing what you're doing. That's what I've got, Pete.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. That's our third American Rescue Plan update for the day. And that concludes our presentation. Thanks everybody for being with us. We appreciate you tuning in with us every Tuesday. We'll be back again here next Tuesday with another update. And in the interim, please stay safe.